And now we come to it at last. Star Trek V. Oh, there's a lot to say. Let's dive in. I am Sean Ferrick for Trek Culture, and here are 20 things you didn't know about Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, Part 1. Number 20. A presidential Vulcan. Lawrence Luckenbill joined the ensemble for Star Trek V: The Final Frontier after Shatner saw him play a former US president. Lyndon B. Johnson had been the vice president for John F. Kennedy. His swearing in after the assassination would later become the inspiration behind the inauguration of President Laura Roslin on Ronald D. Moore's reimagined Battlestar Galactica series. Luckenbill appeared as Johnson several times throughout his career. As an actor and a playwright, he had created several productions about the man, but it was not one of his own creations that inspired Shatner to cast him as the emotional Vulcan Sybok. It was during a late-night channel surfing session that Shatner stumbled upon him, deciding in the moment that he had found Spock's half-brother. Though he may not have been the first choice for the role, Luckenbill's performance as Sybok remains one of the true highlights of Star Trek V. He brings charisma to the normally stoic race, playing brilliantly against Nimoy's usual straight-faced Spock. Number 19. The film isn't part of the official canon, according to Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry was not a fan of Star Trek V. To be fair, that statement could be made about many of the Star Trek films that were released before his death, but there seemed to be a new bitterness regarding the fourth Star Trek sequel. He had issues with William Shatner directing, he had issues with the inclusion of Sybok as a character, he had issues with the storyline overall. William Shatner's sense of humour in the storyline also irked him. Though some of the most crowd-pleasing moments of the film come from the characters' interpersonal relationships and reactions, not least between Chekhov and Sulu and Uhura and Scotty, Roddenberry felt that the story itself simply wasn't up to par. After the release of the film, when asked about it in public, he declared it apocryphal, though he rarely expounded on which parts he deemed non-canon. Some of this, at least, came from Roddenberry's feeling that he had been robbed of a story. Number 18. Can I get an amen? And your bank account details? Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker were among the first direct inspirations behind both Sybok and the mission he is on in the film. The world of TV evangelists fascinated Shatner. By the time that the script was in production, there was more than enough material to make an entire series of Sybok movies if the need arose. The Bakkers had stormed into stardom within the Christian televangelistic scene between the 70s and the 80s, inspiring donations worth millions of dollars from their followers. The PTL Club, their own show, ran from 1975 until 1989, when Jim Bakker's fall from grace forced the show into cancellation. Sybok, in Star Trek V, is shown as a true believer who comes into contact with a being he doesn't understand. In a way, God is the Bakker of the film. The creature at the center of the galaxy is shown to be a hoax, intent merely on escaping its prison, while Sybok's blind belief almost allows that to happen. In reality, Jim Bakker was brought up on charges of sexual misconduct and misappropriation of donated funds, the latter of which he served time in prison for. In life, as in the film, appearances were most certainly deceiving. Number 17. Gene Roddenberry felt that William Shatner stole his idea for the God thing. Gene Roddenberry came close to suing William Shatner over the story ideas behind Star Trek V. In the released film, Sybok brings the crew of the Enterprise face to face with a creature calling itself God. This leads to the infamous line, "What does God need with a starship?" Before Star Trek Phase 2 had evolved into Star Trek the Motion Picture, there was the God Thing, a Trek story written by Roddenberry. Here, God is a starship from another dimension. It travels throughout the galaxy, sending probes to other races, taking different forms. One such probe appears on the Enterprise, taking the appearance of Jesus. The story was not picked up for production, something that Roddenberry would later attribute to religious attitudes in the studio. He then felt that at least some of his ideas were taken by Shatner and reworked into the plot of The Final Frontier, a story that William Shatner himself does not necessarily say is ridiculous. He and his lawyer, Leonard Maislish, prepared a lawsuit against the actor, but they then dropped it before it even proceeded to trial. Number 16. That cameo took a lot of convincing. Harve Bennett joined the Star Trek franchise as executive producer and writer on Star Trek II, remaining a stalwart until his departure after Star Trek V. However, he came close to leaving after Star Trek IV instead. The primary reason for this, somewhat surprisingly, was neither Gene Roddenberry, the usual culprit, or studio meddling, it was Leonard Nimoy. The pair had worked well together for both Star Trek II and Star Trek III. In The Search for Spock, Nimoy had directed, though Bennett had remained on hand at almost all times. Nimoy was not an experienced director, but both later felt that the project was a success. This led to Nimoy being rehired as director for The Voyage Home. It was there they began to clash. Bennett was again on hand to supervise, but Nimoy felt that he had proved himself while directing 3. In Bennett's words, this led to a breakdown in their friendship behind the camera. Now, it would bounce back in the years that followed, but William Shatner had to convince Bennett to take an active part in Star Trek V. That included the cameo on the view screen with Bennett playing Fleet Admiral Robert Bennett. Number 15. It was the shades of grey of the film franchise. A surefire way to make a Trekkie's eye twitch is to tell them that Shades of Grey is the best episode of the show. There's a similar reaction if one says the same about Star Trek V. Both productions ran into similar issues behind the scenes that led, at least in part, to some of the quality problems. Star Trek V and The Next Generation's second season were both in production at the same time. While the latter was largely seen as an improvement in the show's overall quality, it is saddled with the show's worst episode. Shades of Grey exists because of the 1988 Writers Guild of America strike, so, at least in part, does Star Trek V. The strike meant that any unionized writer in Hollywood was unable to either produce or review any scripts at the time. This included scripts that were already in production, like Star Trek V. If there was a consistent feeling throughout the film, it's that a good idea was present, though it needed far tighter handling and more fleshing out. However, with the release date set in stone, there simply wasn't time to wait and see how long the strike would last. This led to the movie's script going into production as it was. The results, more or less, speak for themselves. Number 14. Industrial Light and Magic's help was sorely missed during production. There were several contributing factors to Industrial Light and Magic not returning for Star Trek V's effects. First, their A-team, as described by Shatner, was busy at work on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This would be the second time that production hurt Star Trek V. The B-team, again in Shatner's words, were then more concerned with the effects on Ghostbusters 2. This, he felt, meant that anything that they could give to Star Trek just wouldn't be their best. Executive producer Ralph Winter would later concede that there were other factors, including what he felt was poor treatment on the part of ILM. So an open call was put out to the effects houses in Hollywood, though it was a small company based in Hoboken, New Jersey, who took up the call. Associates in Ferron, named for its owner and namesake, Bran Ferron, had been nominated for an Oscar the previous year for their work on Little Shop of Horrors. Their lo-fi approach to the effects delighted Shatner, who hired them on the spot after seeing a whirlpool effect that would later become the Great Barrier. It quickly became apparent that the company was in over its head. They had a core of about 40 staffers, and Ferron was averse to blue screen technology. Gregory Jean Incorporated and Peter Wallach Enterprises were then subcontracted for all the blue screen work on the movie. This, combined with an unexpected problem on set, led to the poor results. Number 13. It couldn't have been released at a worse time. The summer of 1989 was, frankly, a goldmine for films. Tim Burton delivered his take on The Caped Crusader, starring Jack Nicholson as the Joker and Michael Keaton as Bruce Wayne. The media storm surrounding Batman alone would have made releasing a film a challenge at this time, but it would not be the only contender for the box office that Star Trek had to worry about. Ghostbusters 2 was also released. This franchise had already dealt a number of blows to Trek. Star Trek III: The Search for Spock suffered at the box office due to the release of the first Ghostbusters movie, with domestic gross receipts far lower than expected. The sequel not only affected Fi's profits, but had already taken ILM from them as well. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade would also join this trifecta of villains to push Star Trek V into lower rankings at the box office. The release of these three movies, along with the film's perceived lower quality, contributed to the Final Frontier's position as the lowest grossing Trek movie until Star Trek Nemesis flopped in 2002. Number 12. The filming model of the Enterprise had been vandalized between shoots. When associates in Ferron went to start their work on the model of the Enterprise A, they discovered to their horror that it had been thoroughly changed between Star Trek IV and Star Trek V. While the ship had always been painted with a slightly iridescent paint, which had, in fairness, made it difficult to shoot against blue screen anyway, it had since been slapped with a dull matte grey all along one side. It had been featured in Star Trek Adventure, a joint project between Universal Studios and Paramount Pictures. In the spring of 1988, an effects staffer had spray repainted the matte grey onto the model to avoid that blue screen issue. So when it came time to film Star Trek V, the ship had to be completely restored. The process took weeks. David V. May was the senior model maker responsible for the refurbishment. He got on the phone with Ron Gress, an artist who had painted it back when Star Trek the Motion Picture was in production, so that he could remain true to the original vision. While The Final Frontier would leave the model with even more issues that needed to be addressed in the production of Star Trek VI, the work required pushed the film's already tight shooting schedule back to the edge of breaking point. Number 11. Executive producer Ralph Winter takes a lot of the blame himself. We were smoking our own press releases. This quote alone from Winter seemed to sum up much of the ideas that went into the production of Star Trek V. Winter personally felt as though he was responsible for the poor effects of the film, as it was he who made the decision not to wait for ILM to free up some time to work on the movie. He felt that they had not treated Trek with respect. He also held up his hands when it came to the actual story of the movie himself. In a way, it was rehashing the ground already trodden by Star Trek the Motion Picture, but he felt that the search for God was certainly a contributing factor to the film's dismal reception. He likened the script searching for God to the production team's beliefs that, at this point at least, they could do no wrong. While he doesn't agree with some of Shatner's feelings on how the studio treated V after its release, he does believe that when it came to The Final Frontier, he dropped the ball, no matter how well his previous efforts had been received. That's everything for the first part of this list, folks. Please don't forget to tune back for part 2. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can catch us over on Twitter at Trek Culture, and you can catch myself at Sean Ferrick on Twitter as well. Until I see you again, you look after yourself, look after your friends and family, and remember, the moon is a window to heaven. Live long and prosper. Thanks.